Welcome everyone to Central Queens Independent Democrats' second meeting. We have this special session. It's a workshop with redistricting expert Professor Jeffrey Wice. He is an adjunct professor at New York Law School, and he can tell you a little bit more about himself too, so that you can appreciate what he will be sharing with us. So without further ado, Jeff, please continue. I think he'll need to be able to share his screen.
Right, I'll start sharing in a moment. I'll just introduce myself. Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. My name is Jeff Wice. As Maria indicated, I work as an adjunct professor and senior fellow at New York Law School, where I both teach redistricting and run a New York Census and Redistricting Institute. Through that office, I provide these kinds of training seminars, workshops all across New York State on the upcoming redistricting process of congressional, state legislative, city council, and other local government districts across New York State. I hadn't planned a career in this line of work, but years back, I used to represent the New York State Assembly in Washington, D.C. In the late 1970s, I was asked to go out to the Census Bureau to find out about the census because working for the new Democratic leadership in the Assembly, and it sounds a little odd to call it the new Democratic leadership, but keep in mind that although Democrats have held the majority in the New York Assembly since 1975, prior to 1975, Democrats only controlled very few years in between, 1911, 1932-33, and 1965-66, maybe 67. So Democrats had not redistricted since 1911 in their 1 year in power after the 1910 census. But in 1980, New York lost 5 congressional districts. That's a record. And I was in the catbird seat at a to represent then Speaker Stanley Fink during that process. I went on to serve as counsel on redistricting to 5 Assembly speakers, 4 Democratic Senate leaders, 2 New York City Council redistricting commissions, and I've worked all across the country for state government legislatures, for local governments and elected officials. And most recently co-authored and edited a handbook published by the National Conference of State Legislatures on the redistricting process. What I'll do tonight is share my screen with you and walk through a presentation on what redistricting is, why it's important, what it does, how it happens, the process, and how you can get engaged with it, and where this whole thing will take us down the road. So I will share my screen at this point. Okay. So do we see the full screen now with the share screen? I see has
yes.
Okay. So what is redistricting? Prior to really the last 10 years, not many people paid much attention to it. It was considered a backroom politics. Here I show a cartoon of a jigsaw puzzle of someone trying to figure out how to put together all these strange pieces, many of which I guess it's, could be said are electoral districts drawn by somebody someplace, but all in the artist's good faith. Now, last year, many of you were probably involved with taking the 2020 census. And before I get into the redistricting process, I'll just mention that the census, aside from driving how district lines are drawn to meet the equal population requirement of the Constitution, federal and state law, New York State receives billions of dollars from Washington for about 300 different kinds of programs. It's hard to break down how the programs impact each New Yorker because they're based on different kinds of formulas. But we know that where federal funding is based on per capita spending per person for 16 major programs, And I list some of them above: basically healthcare, transportation, education, senior services, Title 8, Section 1 education aid. New York received $53 billion in fiscal year 2016. So that breaks down on a per person basis to $2,687 per person. And that's just for 16 out of over 300 programs. Now, when it comes to the importance of the census for reapportionment, during World War II, New York had 45 members in the House of Representatives. Today, New York has only 27 members in the House, the same number the state had going back to the 1820s. The state is now projected to lose at least one congressional district, possibly two. And when we look at what districts are, for those of you who've seen this presentation before, I've updated it a bit, but bear with me. This shows you the location of New York's current congressional districts. These are districts that were drawn by a federal court, Eastern District of Long Island, Queens, Brooklyn, in 2011, after the legislature failed to develop a plan of its own. So you can see these districts are rather large. They have about 700,000 people per district. We also have a slightly smaller scale of about 300,000 people per district, state Senate districts. And then, of course, we have state assembly districts, which have about 150 or so thousand people per district, and they're much more numerous because they're smaller. And the Senate and assembly lines were last drawn by the state legislature in 2012 in a bill that was approved by Governor Cuomo. But what's happened from where we were last year when I last met with this group to today? Well, the census was delayed completely by the pandemic. The census count, which usually is scheduled to end in July, extended all the way to October because back in the spring, beginning about March 15th, everything shut down, and the Census Bureau had mail going out to people to respond to the census, but person-to-person contact just shut down completely, and the Census Bureau wasn't able to put anybody back out on the streets in a very limited way until May. So the census count extended to October. Donald Trump's efforts to adjust the numbers failed. As you may recall, Trump tried to add a last-minute citizenship question to the census. That was added for the purported reason of the Justice Department needing better citizenship data to enforce the Federal Voting Rights Act. That was all a pretext to fraud. The courts, through several court cases, it was clearly brought forward that the Justice Department had no need for this data, that they were put up to asking for it by the political people in the White House using Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross as the stooge to move this effort forward. Trump, after the Supreme Court said you cannot add a citizenship question because it takes 4 or 5 years to add such a question to the census, not 1 week's time, as Trump tried to do back in 2017, that failed. And subsequently, last summer, July 2020, Trump tried to create administrative records files of undocumented immigrants, or as he calls them, illegal aliens, to subtract those numbers from the state population totals used to reapportion or reallocate members of Congress amongst the states. And that ended up going to the Supreme Court as well. In December, the Supreme Court ruled that we don't even know yet if the Trump administration can concoct numbers of undocumented persons. They even admit they can't do it. So rather than stop them from doing so, as New York did in a lawsuit against Trump, the Supreme Court said, let's wait and see what Trump can do to subtract undocumented persons. And by mid to late December, Trump's attention went elsewhere, as we all know, and it was an issue that fizzled. But because of the pandemic, the data delivery has been delayed quite extensively. The Commerce Department is supposed to, under federal statute, report the state population totals and the number of districts to which each state is entitled in Congress by December 31st. And then by April 1st, the Census Bureau is required to send the states the granular age, race, and ethnicity data to send to the states for redistricting. Well, if those two statutory deadlines can't be met, we've already seen December 31st come by and nothing happened. So I'll show you in a second where things stand now and what's going to be happening this year. Now, first off, reapportionment. Reapportionment is simply the reallocation of 435 congressional districts among the 50 states. It's determined by a federal statutory formula. It takes just an hour or so to run the numbers. Once you have the state population totals, you feed it into the computer, and out comes the number of seats states are allocated based on proportions of population after each state receives one congressional district. That's 1 through 50. Districts 51 through 435 are allocated district by district to the states based on the state's population. So that information now won't be available until April 30th. That's the date when we'll find out whether New York loses 1 or 2 congressional districts. Now, redistricting comes next. There are 2 different processes. Redistricting is the actual redrawing of district boundaries within a state, a county, or a city for Congress, the state legislature, city council, or local governments. And that data won't arrive now until September 30th. Late by 5 months, since the data should have been delivered to the state by April 1st. Now, just to give you an idea, again, of the numbers of what we're looking at, New York has a population of about 19.5 million people. For the 27 current congressional districts, each one has approximately 717,000 people. I say approximately because the courts have ruled that congressional districts, according to Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, are required to be exactly equal in population from district to district. So when you look at these numbers of 717,000 people, they might differ by 1 or 2 people from district to district. For the state Senate, where we have 63 districts, or about 310,000 people per district, and for the state assembly, for which there are 150 districts and 130,000 people per district, the populations can vary up to +5 or -5% for an overall difference in average population of overall 10%. And that's because under the Constitution, the Supreme Court has held, under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, that state districts, city districts, local districts are different than congressional districts, that they reflect the different kinds of state laws, state customs, state histories, that you can vary in population for all non-congressional districts. The laws that govern redistricting for New York State, there are basically 3 of them. First off, as I mentioned, you have the US Constitution's 1 person, 1 vote population equality requirement. That comes out of both the Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, which calls for a census for the purposes of distributing congressional districts among the states, and the 14th Amendment, which requires equal protection for all residents under the law. The second requirement is compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act kicks in where you have a large number of minority voters, in particular, Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American, and Native American Islanders. And if they are denied the ability to elect their preferred candidates by the white majority, then the Voting Rights Act kicks in and requires that certain levels of minority districts be created. Now, some of you may remember something called Section 5 preclearance, another federal Voting Rights Act provision that the Supreme Court kicked out in 2013. Section 5 required that for Brooklyn, the Bronx, and New York counties, not Queens, based on a 1960s formula, that any redistricting plan, poll place, location change in any election law had to be pre-cleared or pre-approved by the Federal Justice Department or by a special federal court in Washington, D.C. But Section 5 is no longer being enforced. Supreme Court made a decision that most of us disagree with, but I'm mentioning it because it was a very prevalent factor in state redistricting up until 2013. Finally, we've got the New York State Constitution, which had very few rules on redistricting prior to 2014, when New York's voters approved a constitutional amendment creating what's called legally the New York Independent Redistricting Commission, a commission that advises the state legislature with draft plans for the Assembly, the Senate, and Congress. In 2013, a state court ruled that on the ballot question for the so-called independent commission, the word independent couldn't be used because the legislature can really enact whatever plan it wants, could accept or reject or modify the commission's plan. So it wasn't truly independent, but on paper and in the Constitution, it's called the Independent Redistricting Commission. I'm going to spend some time discussing how the commission operates momentarily. The tools that are used for redistricting are somewhat basic and complex. We have something called PL 94-171 block level data. That got its name from the 1975 federal law that requires the Census Bureau to provide states with granular data based on race, age, and ethnicity to the states. And it's that data that gets fed into high-speed software that actually draws the lines. The software enables you to sit before a computer, see the map, see the numbers, move the cursor, and add or subtract blocks of population so that districts can be drawn. When I say blocks of population, the Census Bureau uses terminology called census blocks, which are about the size of an election district in New York City. So you basically add up as many election districts as you need to create a district to meet the population requirements. As you move the cursor, you'll see the different kinds of ethnic populations, racial populations, voting age populations, and that's the nitty gritty of how the lines get drawn. Who draws the lines? Well, prior to this decade, the legislature's task force on redistricting is called LAT4, the Legislative Advisory Task Force on Reapportionment. Should have been called redistricting, but that was named 40 years ago, and I won't get into the differences going back that long. But LAT4 drew the lines for the Assembly, the Senate, and up until 2011, when there was disagreement by the then Speaker and Senate Majority Leader, congressional lines. Now we have a New York State Commission. I'll discuss more about the commission because it's not yet quite functioning, but it'll be their job to hire people to draw the draft plans for the legislature to consider later this year. Now, this commission is tasked with following several kinds of criteria. Obviously, the first two criteria are federally mandated: population equality and Voting Rights Act compliance. The state also requires that districts be compact, meaning that districts have to be of a normal shape, square, rectangular, round, but not having 50 different sides that jut out in all different directions, more or less compact so that you can visualize it rather easily. Contiguity, that means that you can go from one point of a district all the way to another point of the district and not have to leave the district or get your feet wet. I say that seriously because former Congressman Gary Ackerman made an art of describing his 1990s era district by saying that he was able to stay within his district on the North Shore by walking along the Queens, Nassau, Suffolk County shore at low tide when he wouldn't get his feet wet because they connected the North Shore by low tide. We try not to do that. Another criteria is to keep communities of interest intact. A community of interest is self-defined. A community of interest could be a socioeconomic community where people have like-minded incomes or social leanings. A community of interest can be an area with a lot of schools, colleges, hospitals. It's what you really make of it. I learned my lesson on communities of interest in Queens in 1992. I was counsel to then Assembly Speaker Saul Weprin from Queens, and we held a hearing on Assembly Senate redistricting at Borough Hall. And in our first draft plan, we had a ton of people complain that we cut Malba in half. Now, I'm a New Yorker. I thought I knew neighborhoods pretty well, but none of us knew that Malba was a community situated at the foot of the Whitestone Bridge, that we unintentionally divided the community. We quickly put it back together again. Another criteria is to follow jurisdictional boundaries. That applies more outside of New York City, but you essentially want to keep towns, villages, communities intact. Now, the Constitution also includes two different kinds of incumbent-related factors, that you should not pair two incumbents together in the same district, nor should you develop a plan that favors or disfavors a political party. Now, one thing you'll find is in trying to balance all of these criteria, which aren't ranked, you probably can't meet each one of them, but you try to accommodate a majority of them. And before I finish tonight, I'm going to show you some of the criteria that the New York City Council is required to redistrict by, and you'll see how ranked prioritized criteria could make a difference. This gets a little bit in the weeds, so there's no quiz after this program, but I hope you just get the idea that you do have to follow some kind of criteria in developing these district lines. Now, we have this independent commission. It's got 10 members. 8 of them are appointed by the state legislative leaders. Speaker Hasty appointed Albany veteran Elaine Frazier and a Manhattan attorney Eugene Benger. Senate President, Majority Leader, temporary President Andrea Stewart Cousins appointed Dr. John Flateau from Brooklyn's Medgar Evers College, a former member of the New York City Board of Elections, and a Westchester County attorney, David Imamura, who also happens to be coincidentally from the same firm as Eugene Benger, but no relationship. On the Republican side, Senate Minority Leader Robert Ort appointed George Winter, who served 3 decades in the legislature, and former Nassau County Senator Jack Martins. And on the Assembly Minority side, Leader Will Barclay appointed Charlie Nesbitt, himself a former Assembly Minority Leader, and Keith Wofford, who you may recall ran for Attorney General in 2018, losing to Tish James. Those 8 members agreed on appointing 2 so-called independent members. One is Dr. Evelise Cuevas Molina, who's a professor at Fordham, and Ross Brady, a Brooklyn attorney and Temple administrator. Professor Dr. Cuevas Molina tends to side with the Democrats. Ross Brady, who's a conservative party leader in Brooklyn, tends to side with the Republicans. Those are the 10 members. Now, how does the process work? Well, to start off, the commission is supposed to undertake a robust outreach effort to engage the public about redistricting. They've got to follow the criteria that I've just outlined. And then once they are ready to draw maps, they're able to submit up to 2 sets of plans to the state legislature for Congress, state Senate, and Assembly district lines. Now, after the first set of maps is sent to the legislature The legislature can accept the maps, pass them as a simple chapter law. They can reject them. And on the third round of line drawing, I'll get into each of these rounds, the legislature can basically do whatever it wants. But on the first round, the legislature gets a plan from the commission. It can accept it, it can reject it. If it's accepted, it goes to the governor. The governor can accept it and sign it into law, or he can veto it. Whatever happens, new plans have to be in place for 2022 elections. The commissioners also have to select one member to serve as chair. They've deadlocked so far. The Democrats nominated a Democrat, and the Republicans nominated a Republican, and they've deadlocked 5-5 because there's no odd number tiebreaker. The legislature has appropriated $1 million for the commission to operate through next month, and more money can be appropriated for next year in the state budget. But the commission hasn't received a single penny so far to operate. The legislature put the money in the governor's office, in the Department of State. The Department of State claims that it's been a complex process, that it's not that easy to move money around. No one quite understands that logic, but the Department of State has entered into its own contract with the State University of New York SUNY Foundation, so that the foundation, which is a separate not-for-profit organization, could administer and oversee the commission's operations. The commission said 2 weeks ago, this is nuts, this is crazy, we have no money, we don't even have money to get a phone line or an email address. We don't want anything to do with the governor's commission. Please, legislature, fund us back independently in the state budget to be considered next month and adopted before April 1st. So the reason you haven't seen much happen yet is because the commission meets as volunteers using the state legislature's website about once a month, but they can't do anything except try to figure out how to get their money. That's an ongoing saga that will eventually be figured out. But if you read any day's newspaper about the governor and the legislature, or just the governor, it's politics. Let me leave it at that. The commission is also selected, but can't yet hire 2 co-executive directors, very similar to the process used to hire, to appoint county elections commissioners, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican. So Karen Blatt, an Assembly Democratic staffer, has been selected to run the Democratic side, and Doug Breckel, who works for the Republicans in the State Senate in Albany, is the other co-director. They're working as volunteers right now. So back to the timeline here, the Census Bureau will deliver the data to the state based on the 2020 census on September 30th. This leaves the commission with only 3 months to develop plans, down from what should have been 9 months as they had originally planned and thought they'd be operating. Before they can approve plans, the commission must go around the state and hold 12 specific hearings that are outlined in the Constitution. There will be a hearing in Queens. And the commission must make public its first draft plan. It's supposed to be September 15th, but that's not going to happen since the data won't arrive until September 30th. But they do have to hold a public hearing after releasing a plan, which I would guesstimate at this point would probably be sometime in early November. And of course, maps have to be developed and agreed to by the commission before they could be sent to the legislature. Now, it's important to note that given the commission's makeup of 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 2 independents, and the likelihood or the possibility that the commission might deadlock at a 5-5 vote, the commission might not be able to send anything to the legislature. So just be mindful of that. And if that does happen, then the legislature itself will be empowered to draw the maps as it had in the past. Now, the voting patterns created in the Constitution to move a plan from the commission to the legislature and from the legislature to the governor are quite complex. And I've tried to narrow down how they operate under today's political situation. Currently, the commission is set up so that the minority party's voice is taken into consideration. In prior decades, at least since the 1980s, the Assembly Democrats and the Senate Republicans drew their own lines. The Assembly didn't criticize or comment on the Senate, nor did the Senate criticize or make any changes in the Assembly plan. Although every governor I've seen has threatened to veto plans, none has ever done so, at least not since Franklin Roosevelt. And but the question here now is that in getting 7 of the 10 commissioners to agree to send a plan to the legislature, you need 7 of 10. You have to have at least one appointee from each of the 4 legislative leaders. In plain English, that means that at least one Republican from the Senate and one Republican from the Assembly have to agree to a plan. That gives the Republicans powerful, a major power, a say in what happens, because without their vote, without their support, the commission can't move forward. The Constitution, I'll mention, does provide other voting requirements if the legislature is under divided political control. Then if the Assembly was Democratic, let's say, and the Senate Republican, then the 7 votes had to include at least one appointee by the Speaker and one by the Senate temporary president, meaning at least one Democrat, one Republican. And if the commission under current law cannot get 7 members to agree on a plan, then the plan or plans with the greatest support can be submitted to the legislature along with recorded vote tallies. That assumes they're going to be able to vote or move something forward. We don't know yet if they can do that. I'm not being negative. I'm just suggesting that we don't know yet how far the commission will be able to proceed. Now, having said all of that, there is another constitutional amendment question that you will have the ability to vote on this November, and I'll summarize that as I continue, because this is a bit like a Rube Goldberg scenario. You take 2 steps forward, you think you understand it, you take 1 step to the side and find your 1 step backwards. So try to bear with this process as I explain it. Now, under the current law, the commission is supposed to submit its Assembly and Senate plans to the legislature by January 1st, although it does have a grace period as late as January 15th of next year. The pending constitutional amendment sets a deadline of January 1st without the grace period if the voters approve it. Usually, Assembly and Senate plans have been included in the same bill, not with Congress, but now the Congressional plan can be added to the same bill with the Senate and Assembly lines. It used to be the joke that the legislature would enact the Assembly and Senate lines first, then see who the winners and losers were. And then if anybody wasn't happy with their Assembly or Senate lines, they could run for Congress in the plan that was enacted afterwards. But this is an option for the commission to consider, as well as the legislature. Now, getting back to the enactment track, the legislature can approve the first plan without amendments and send it to the governor to approve or veto. The legislature can also reject that plan itself. If the legislature rejects the first plan, or if the governor vetoes it, then the commission must submit a second plan to the legislature no later than February 28th, 2022. And if approved without amendments, it goes to the governor, who can himself either approve or veto. The constitutional amendment that you'll vote on in November sets that first plan deadline, the second plan deadline from February 28th to January 15th. Now, if the second plan is rejected by the legislature or vetoed by the governor, then the legislature can amend the second plan as it deems necessary. That means essentially they can do whatever they want to do. Now, gubernatorial vetoes of the first and second plans can be overridden, and the Democrats do have 2/3 in both chambers now. If it comes to the point where the legislature itself is drawing the lines, then the legislature must follow the same criteria as the commission, but it has a lot more leeway to make accommodations, particularly if it needs to accommodate incumbent members. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, no governor has vetoed redistricting plans since Franklin Roosevelt, who was the Democratic governor in 1931, vetoed the Republican legislature's plan of that year. 10 years prior to that, when Al Smith was governor, he also vetoed the Republican legislature's plan. But in my time, governors Carey, Cuomo, Pataki, Cuomo, none of them, although threatening to, none of them have ever vetoed a redistricting plan. This commission was put together as part of the 2012 so-called Big Ugly in Albany, when the legislature enacted the budget, other reforms, the 2012 redistricting plan, and this new constitutional amendment commission. Now, as I mentioned, any plan developed and agreed to by the Assembly and the Senate are subject to gubernatorial approval or veto and can be overridden. The Assembly and Senate vote requirements differ based on who controls the chambers, and keeping in mind that this amendment was drafted by the Senate Republicans in 2012 when they still controlled the state Senate. So they put into the law that if one party, as we have today, controls both chambers, at least 2/3 of the members of each chamber must approve a commission plan or any plan. And the Republicans never thought that the Democrats would actually have 2/3 in both chambers in 2021. When this was drafted, if the chambers had divided control, you needed just a simple majority, meaning that a simple majority of 76 members in the Assembly and 32 members in the Senate could pass a plan. And at the point this was drafted in 2012, as you recall, the Assembly was solidly Democratic, but the Senate was run by a coalition of Republicans and the Independent Democratic Conference, which has since disappeared. These provisions will also be changed by the pending constitutional amendment. Now, once you have a plan enacted by the legislature, signed by the governor, any New York voter can take the plan to state Supreme Court to challenge it. And the Constitution creates a new requirement that the trial court has 60 days to make a decision, or 2 months. While the amendment only mentions bringing original lawsuits to the state Supreme Court, it follows, though, that appeals could be filed subsequently with the appellate division or the Court of Appeals. And if the courts reject a plan enacted by the legislature, signed by the governor, the legislature is empowered to develop a remedial plan, which the governor would also have to then approve if it comes to that. And there have been plans in New York, minor situations where plans have had to be fixed down the road. Now, one major piece of unfinished business as I begin winding down is the 2010 law that the state enacted that reallocated prison populations from their prison locations to their homes of record prior to incarceration. Basically, if you were incarcerated in, let's say, Dannemora up in the North Country, you would be counted for redistricting purposes based on living in that upstate county. And that was, those populations were used to inflate the districts there with people who might have been incarcerated there, but really weren't living there, so to speak. So in 2010, a state law was passed that required the removal of prisoners back to their homes of record prior to incarceration, so that I don't have the numbers in front of me, but several hundred Queens residents who were incarcerated in upstate prisons were reallocated to Queens County to their census blocks for the purposes of state assembly and state Senate redistricting. The pending constitutional, the 2014 amendment that we're living under now did not include that provision, ostensibly because the Republicans who helped draft the amendment were opposed to the prisoner reallocation law. They claim it cost them a district in 2012, where they accommodated the loss by increasing the size of the Senate to 63 to accommodate the loss. Now, the pending constitutional amendment would reallocate prisoners back to their homes prior to incarceration as a constitutional requirement, and also include doing this for congressional districts as well. We weren't quite sure in 2010, given the differences between state level requirements under the 14th Amendment and Article 1, Section 2 requirements on equal population for congressional districts, whether we can do that before, but the courts have since said, based on the Maryland case, that it was permissible. So I've talked about an amendment. This was an amendment that Queens Senator Mike Gianaris was the sponsor of in the Senate. And in July of 2020, the Senate passed, followed by the Assembly. And then subsequently in a newly elected legislature, the one that was elected this past November, the Senate and Assembly repassed the same language in the Gianaris Assembly Rodriguez Zabrowski bill, so that it goes before the voters this November. It requires two separately elected legislatures to approve and place a constitutional amendment on the ballot. So the changes would include, rather than the complex requirements of whether the Democrats and the Republicans split control of the Assembly and Senate or one-party controls, and how that affects the commission membership, any 7 commission members are needed to approve a plan. Secondly, January 1st, 2022 becomes the deadline for the commission's first set of plans to be sent to the legislature. January 15th is the deadline for the commission's second plan if the legislature or governor rejects the first plan. And instead of having a 2/3 requirement to approve a plan with one party in control of both chambers, you simply need a basic majority in the Senate and Assembly, as you would for every other kind of law considered by the legislature. If the commission itself fails to develop a plan, if it deadlocks and does nothing, then you need 60% vote in the Senate and the Assembly. So there is a carve out to make it a little bit tougher, but as we all know now, there is a 2/3 majority for the Democrats in both chambers. When Senator Gianaris drafted this amendment last summer, nobody was had in their sights that the Democrats would do so well in carrying the majority of the Senate. The amendment also sets the size of the Senate at 63 districts. There was a provision in the state constitution drafted back in 1894 that the Senate size could increase based on a lot of archaic factors I won't get into. The amendment also eliminates the requirement for partisan co-executive directors while still leaving co-executive directors. It would basically remove, under today's leadership, a Republican co-director if the commission so desires. And as I showed you in the last slide, the amendment would end the practice of prison gerrymandering, of keeping prisoners at their prison locations to inflate districts upstate, and instead reallocate prisoners back to their homes of record prior to incarceration, mostly in urban centers and around the state. And just a final word, because after New York State redistricts, we have New York City Council redistricting, which is done in a different way than the state process. In New York City, the new mayor will appoint 7 members to a commission, and the council leaders, meaning the new speaker and the new minority leader, will appoint 15 members to a commission to redraw the city council lines. And the city council commission can develop a set of plans that the council can accept or reject. But if the council rejects the first plan, similar to the state process, the commission's second plan becomes final without going back to the city council, and becomes final upon filing it with the city clerk. I'll just also mention that because we now operate under a spring primary situation. And this also, I should have mentioned, the dates are moved from January, February to early January, so that the legislature itself the New York legislature has to complete its work by the end of January next year so that 2022 elections and petitioning can start in February. It takes about a month for the county boards of elections to transfer the new districts into election readable data, which might involve redrawing some of the election districts to comport with the new assembly districts. Since, as you all probably know, election districts are, assembly districts are comprised of whole election districts. I think the last thing I've got is that the New York City Council criteria is ranked in this order: that population, equal population, fair minority representation, keeping communities of interest are followed, but also it has definitions for what compactness is, that a district in the city council can't be twice as long as wide, that districts shall not cross borough or county boundaries more than once or twice, that you can't divide Democrats, Republicans in the same party into 2 or more districts, which actually enables, out of the 51 city council districts, at least I think it's 3 Republicans to get elected now. New York City is such a blue city. Also, there are requirements on the shapes that districts have to, you should have to minimize some of the length of the boundaries in all districts. It defines how you have contiguity. Obviously, Staten Island has to share some population with another borough, and here, the city charter lists that you can connect a district by a bridge, a tunnel, or a tramway or ferry service. We're New Yorkers, we all know what those mean. And it also limits the splits among boroughs. So that's my presentation. I hope I haven't confused everybody. And if you'd like to contact me in the future, my email address is listed here, and I'd be glad to take any questions or comments.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was wonderful as usual. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for a question and answer period. So everybody, just to keep it orderly, let's use the chat function. If you have a question, please type stack, S-T-A-C-K, and this way we'll call on you. I'll call on you one at a time. Or alternatively, you can just type in your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud and then Jeff can answer the questions, okay? Why is this participant? Sorry. Oh, okay. So right away, Mark Laster.
Yeah, hi Jeff. Thanks a lot for the presentation.
Hi,
It was good. Good evening. How are you? So I guess my question is, where's Squid sitting here? So exactly what do you like? What can we do? You've gone through this whole process. What are couple things that we can do at this point to interact with this process?
Well, I think you should basically take the presentation that I gave and bring it to your communities so that people understand the process, that they can learn about what I just outlined between now and September. Obviously, at some point, probably after April 1st, when the commission finally gets its funding, it's going to do outreach of its own. But, I can't speak to that yet because nothing has happened yet. But once the commission is up and running, and even if the commission never gets to reach its goal of developing a plan, they do have to have hearings. And given the condensed schedule between October and January, that even if the commission fails to do its job, the legislature, when it picks up and tries to finish the job itself, can look back at the commission's work history. So there will be a hearing in Queens County. It's required by law. People should testify. People should organize. I remember going to a hearing in Brooklyn where over 100 Russian immigrants showed up, many of them in Russian military attire, talking about don't divide Brooklyn's Russian communities. So you can see visually a presence. I mentioned how Malba organized at the foot of the Whitestone Bridge. So you want to organize your communities. You're also going to have many of the voting rights organizations very active. There's a group called the Unity Coalition that consists of the city's major Black, Asian American, and Latino organizations that will be working on a unity map to make sure that their communities are properly reflected in congressional, Senate, and Assembly plans. The media also will be playing this up, writing more about it as time goes on. So you'll see, hopefully, the ability to educate, organize, speak out, and have an impact.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And redistricting is absolutely a top priority for this club. Also, Jeff, I just wanted to clarify something. And Cameron Jones actually was on stack first. My apologies, Cameron. I'm so sorry. But I just wanted to clarify that this group is actually Central Queens Independent Democrats. We're a new Democratic club. However, I could see where the confusion could come in because one of our missions is to promote grassroots democracy, which my other group, Queens County Committee for All, did. And that was where you had done your previous fabulous presentation back in September. So thank you for coming back. I'm sorry. So Cameron Jones, would you like to pose your question?
So yeah, my question is, does the independent commission drawing up these districts have any actual legal standing that their districts will be put into place, or can the state assembly just override whatever they draw up?
Well, the Assembly and Senate could override the commission's preferences. However, because these plans could be challenged in court, the Assembly and Senate need to justify more than they have in the past the reasons for drawing the districts the way they decide to draw them. As an attorney, I always recommend to anybody I'm working for that each district you draw must be based on some kind of a legal or constitutional argument, that if you can't explain why you drew a district a certain way, then you have, you don't belong in this business, that every district has to be legitimate. So, the commission itself is appointed by legislative leaders, by Democrats and Republicans. So there's no inherent independence per se that they've got because they do have partisan backgrounds themselves. Having said that, California, Arizona, Michigan, they do have commissions where the legislative leaders do not appoint the members of the commission, and those commissions do not report to the legislature, and their plans do not require state legislative or gubernatorial approval. Those are truly independent commissions. But New York's was set up as an advisory process where the legislature can reject commission plans, or if rejected, draw plans however they want to draw them.
Thank you.
I mean, it's too early to know. People hope that the commission will agree, but from the speaking objectively, but looking at partisan politics, when you look at the current need, and we're going to be working under the current statute at least until Election Day, New York is going to lose 1 or 2 congressional districts. It's in the Republicans' interest to make sure that the losses aren't all on their shoulders, so that if, let's say, New York loses 1 congressional district, would that set up a fair fight between 1 Democrat and 1 Republican? If New York loses 2 congressional districts, would that mean 1 Democrat loses and 1 Republican loses? If that happens, with the narrow majority the Democrats have under Speaker Nancy Pelosi now, and New York being a blue state, why would the Democrats in the legislature and the governor want to give up any Democratic district? So there are a lot of different factors that, the politics that goes into this that we can't speak to yet.
And the Chris Hanusa typed in a question. He wrote, given that the Democrats control 2/3 majority, would they really give up their power to do their redistricting? And in parentheses, yes, they want to promote good government.
Well, we'll find that out probably more towards December to see, can the commission agree? That's a big question with no tiebreaker. Our neighbors in New Jersey, have, I think, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats, and a tiebreaker that can go D, that can go R, who's an independent, him or herself. But in New York, there's no tiebreaker. So if they can't agree on one of their own members to be chair of this commission, will they be able to agree on bigger stakes that we live with for 10 years, new district lines? I mean, the commission was created by, let me be very honest, it was an arrangement between Governor Cuomo and the Senate Republicans to get the Senate's 2012 lines passed. So this came in as part of the package. We'll create a commission for the future that we will basically have control over, thinking that they'd never lose control either themselves or with the IDC. Whoever thought until last November, Democrats would have a walloping supermajority in the Senate, and of course have had it in the Assembly.
I mean, Jeff, I haven't been involved in politics as long as you have, but I've learned over the past several years to never say never in politics. So,
Well, I worked for the Democrats in the state Senate from 2003 to 2013, and we held the majority for 2 glorious but crazy years in 2009 and 10, then lost the majority and they worked their way back up and have a supermajority now.
yeah. Next on stack is Miriam Benzemann. Miriam?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand the timeline that the lines will be approved right before petitioning begins.
That's true.
So I don't remember it being that late in the past, and I'm kind of trying to understand the politics of how people usually are running for a while before petitioning.
I'll explain that. Up until 2019, New York had a June primary. From the 1970s until 2019, New York had a June primary. That meant that for the 80s through the 2010 rounds where I was involved, the legislature had to wrap up its line drawing. Governor had to sign a plan by no later than February of the 2-year after the census. That then enabled the plans for Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx to be sent to the Justice Department for what was called pre-clearance. And that was that pre-clearance had a 2-month time frame, so that if you submit a plan in February, you'll have approval by April. And in the meantime, boards of elections, given the likelihood that the lines would be approved by Washington or rejected based on very minor issues, that gave the boards of elections enough time to check the metes and bounds to make sure that, because the way the lines are enacted, it'll say easterly along Queens Boulevard to the Van Wyck Expressway, southerly to Conduit Boulevard, westerly to the Brooklyn line, just east, west, north, south. And often you'd have to drive those boundaries to see if they actually were what the computers said they were. But there was time to do that in 2019, and that way you can start running for office after the Justice Department would approve plans. And there even were instances in the 1980s, 1990s, where the Justice Department rejected the plans or they were in court. But all things said, at least by June or July in the last 3-4 decades, new lines are in place. Sometimes in the 80s, the courts had to condense petitioning and cut back the number of signatures, but you'd have plans in place about 2, 3, 4 months before petitioning would start. Now, with a spring primary in June and petitioning starting in February, you need at least 2 or 3 weeks to get the plans checked and administered into election districts by the boards of elections based on the new lines. So given that the commission has or should have until December 31st, that only gives the legislature about 1 month, which is a really fast-paced process to do all this work. By my reckoning, The legislature and governor need to wrap up their work by January 31st, 2022, in order for petitioning to start about 4 weeks later and still hold a primary in late June 2022. As I mentioned, there is no more Section 5 US DOJ pre-clearance after the Supreme Court gutted the trigger formula that required 3 counties in New York and about 17 states across the country to get pre-clearance.
Great, thank you. Oh, next is Allison Abbalafia. Allison?
Sorry, I had problems unmuting myself. I suppose this is more of a political question, but we all know, well, from what I understand, Cuomo was very much in favor of the IDC, and my understanding is he's trying to create another one in Long Island. And I also heard grumblings that he's trying to eliminate AOCC, as well as I'm sure he's after Ron Kim. I know this commission is supposedly independent, but I'm wondering how much his hand is on the scale, and how much we can fight that, if you could give us any.
Well, the governor plays no role in redistricting except to approve or veto a plan. That's by the books. Politics is something completely different. I am following what's happening with Ron Kim. I am following what's happening with the talk of impeaching the governor or his accountability for the nursing home deaths. That really, I don't want to use the word trumps, might preempt anything logic as to what the law requires. The governor could easily say, I will veto your plans unless you give me something else. And that's what governors have usually threatened to do. But again, the 3 or 4 governors I've seen in my time have always threatened to veto and never have. What might happen in New York this December is anyone's guess. Whether the governor is, I haven't actually heard of creating an IDC effort on Long Island. The Senate Democrats are, to the extent they can, tight-knit, in that the 7 or 8 Long Island Democrats know that they will sink or swim based on delivering for their constituents. Having been counsel the Senate Democrats 10 years ago, we lost 2 or 3 members in Nassau and Suffolk County over the commuter tax. So these issues are very much on their radar, but also the Senate leader is from the other suburb in Westchester, Andrea Stewart-Cousins. She has that suburban outlook that Todd Kaminsky and John Brooks and Anna Kaplan all have themselves. And I think given what's the Senate yesterday passed a major nursing home package that is aimed at the governor. Having worked 40 years in the legislature, they do know how to take care of each other to the degree that the governor is from the other branch of the state government. And the last governor to really have any kind of real control was Nelson Rockefeller. Then they built the legislative office building in Albany. Every legislator got an office, they got staff. I've seen this happen. They are much more independent.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're actually over time, Jeff. We have a few more people on stack and a couple of good. There are actually lots of really good comments in the chat.
You have time.
Is it okay? Can we? I want to be respectful of your time, though. Let
me just mention one last thing on the last question. That the talk about eliminating AOC's district to me is totally far-fetched. That although the Voting Rights Act might not require the maintenance of that district because of the formulas used, I think it would be sort of the opposite of rational to eliminate a minority or type district in New York City to begin with, and a Democratic district in New York City. The population losses in New York State have all been upstate New York. Why sacrifice a district in the heart of where population growth has increased, although the population has not kept up with the rate in the last 10, 20 years? It is only because of immigrant growth in the 5 boroughs.
Excellent, excellent point. Chris Hanusa posted, is there a way to propose our own redistricting maps? And he also made a comment, I know there was a really good Dave's redistricting app that allows for small d democratic input.
Yeah, I'm actually going to include that in future presentations, that there are 3 or 4 different websites you can go to begin playing with the maps. If you Google, I'll give this to you one by one, Dave's apps, that is sort of the most well-known layperson tool to draw maps. There's also something called District Builder, which is a little bit more in depth. And just Google District Builder. A third one is called Representable, REPRESENTABLE. It's a project of the Princeton University Princeton Gerrymandering Project, and they allow you to look at communities of interest and play around with map drawing there. Another one, last one, is called District R, DISTRICTR, and that was created by a group of mathematicians at Tufts University outside Boston, and that lets you draw together either districts or communities. You'll get a sense of how these maps work. If you spend some time on any of these applications, you can save the data, create an account for yourself, and really work to develop maps.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Also, there's if you also Google the redistricting game, there's a university in California that you don't draw lines, but it's sort of like a children's game where you're playing Democrat or Republican or good government or minority group, and you get to draw districts, and it tells you if you're winning or losing.
Love it. Next on stack is Heather Dimitriatis. Heather.
Good evening. Thank you so much for tonight. Just 2 things. The first thing I think about when we talk about redistricting and you were talking about upstate is, quite honestly, I think politically it makes sense to sort of redistrict Stefanik, if anybody. I mean, she's not necessarily had good behavior, and we may, if we can redistrict it properly, may make movement, at least for the Democratic side. So that's the one thought I have. And then the second thing I'm concerned about is, considering we're keeping it so nip and tuck to petitioning, I believe that this is going to come up at the same time that we're going to be looking for people to run for district leaders and county committee. And even so, if it takes so long to get the assembly lines drawn, how is it going to, then we're going to have to wait even longer, I think, for the party to establish what Part A and Part B are, because that's not dictated by any sort of anything written down. It's just kind of willy-nilly.
Well, that's why I'm saying it takes at least 2 to 3 weeks for each county board of elections to figure out where these new lines are and how to run an election using them.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. Okay, so that was Heather. I'm just trying to see because there are some comments. Laura Shepard, did you have a question, or were you just typing in the chat?
Yeah, my question is, so you mentioned this districts are supposed to be drawn so that they're contiguous without getting your feet wet, but we have districts that are only connected by vehicle-only bridges. And in a lot of ways, I think that this reduces, our, the organizing power of constituents. Is there any, is that actually clarified anywhere, or is there any way?
It's not clarified to that extent that traditionally legislators have built districts based on what I call census blocks, that you can join adjacent census blocks together, even though there might not be a road that you can, usually is considered driving, but it's a good point you bring out about walking. But I remember
can't walk to like the Bronx part of AOC's district. I don't know anybody there.
Yeah, well, I think, well, you can, I mean, actually, I don't remember. Can you walk from Queens to the Bronx? Can you walk, are
You
there,
can walk over the Triborough, but that's not contiguous with New York 14.
yeah, but by census blocks, I'm just guessing because I remember years back, the late Congressman Tom Manton asked me why one of the islands near the Triborough were in his district, not Manhattan. I explained, well, they're contiguous by water census blocks, that they were adjacent to each other. This doesn't, that's why we suggest that if you're going to be honest about it, that you draw districts where you can go from part A to part B and walk them or drive them to the extent that you don't have to leave the district. And for those of you who know Nassau County, there's a county legislative district that adjoins Queens County from Cambria Heights all the way down to the Rockaways. And it goes from, if you know, Valley Stream, Elmont area down to Inwood, but it's not contiguous at all by foot or by auto. You've got to go into the water. And it was justified by the Republicans who drew that plan because the census blocks were adjacent to each other. I wouldn't do that. And that's where Gary Ackerman would joke that he would roll up his pants legs to, cross from one part of his district to another, because during normal high tide times, you couldn't do that. But that's one of the things you need to learn about. If you see that a district doesn't make sense, that you don't know who your neighbors are in a different borough, that you have to cross the Triborough Bridge on foot, because not everybody has a car.
I have a bike. I do it. I mean, it's not the safest, but
I've never thought of walking across the Triborough Bridge, the span that goes from Queens to the big span.
I mean, I bike it all the time, but yeah, getting to AOC's district is harrowing.
Yeah, but also keep in mind that there are population equality requirements, and that's why it used to be where the city's population was so large that districts were kept totally within Queens or the Bronx. But with the state's loss of congressional districts, those kinds of population equality requirements sort of preempt the arguments of safe travel inside the district, but as long as they're contiguous in some kind of legal definition. But the courts are going to rule that equal population comes before personal convenience.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, some people made the comments that the Staten Island, Brooklyn districts are weird too.
Again, Staten Island cannot, sustain whole districts by itself. If you start all the way by Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and work your way towards the Verrazano, depending on whether it's city council, assembly, or Senate or Congress, clearly for Congress is a good example. Staten Island does not have 700,000 people. So it's got to be, joined by either the Verrazano Bridge to Brooklyn or the Staten Island Ferry to Manhattan. And prior to 1982, the current Staten Island district did include Lower Manhattan. Since 1982, it's included Brooklyn.
Yeah, I was just laughing because Miriam typed "give Staten Island to New Jersey." I had to just highlight that one.
The story goes that New York won Staten Island in a boat race with New Jersey, that the loser of a boat race keeps Staten Island. Whether it's true or not, I forget, but I think that story is behind us.
Okay, so I believe that's it for questions, correct, people? I don't see anybody else. Now Allison feels bad for Staten Island. Yeah, me too. A little, just a little. Thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciate your coming in. I hope that this is definitely a top. We know how important redistricting is, and so this club is definitely going to stay on top of it. In fact, just for everybody to know, Anicia Ion and Mark Laster are co-chairs of an ad hoc committee that we formed like immediately as part of our community and civic engagement committee. We're focusing on redistricting. So it's one of our top legislative or whatever else, we're on it this year. And so we're going to keep in touch with Professor Wice. And, Jeff, whatever you need, whatever we need to do, we're all about small d democracy. And so whatever we can do to make sure that the people are represented, please let us know. And, we're behind you. We're behind the commission.
My pleasure. And I look forward to maybe coming back this spring and meeting with you again with an update.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank
good
you.
night, everybody. Pleasure.
Thanks. Happy Purim. Bye.